Okay. Ralph, are we, I think we're on. So do you want to call the meeting to order, guys? Raul?
We are. Mr. Chair,
I don't have a gavel, but I will if I have to.
so the meeting is called to order. All members of the board are present, sir.
Hello, hello. All right. Welcome, everybody, to our charter review. What is it? Charter Review and Revision Board. It's been a few weeks since we last met, so hopefully everybody's having a good beginning to their summer. So all present.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you all have had a chance to review the agenda. First item on the agenda is minutes from our last meeting. Anybody want to make a motion or make edits, suggestions? Okay. Motion by Julie, second by Michael Band. All in favor? Any opposed? Hearing none, then it passes unanimously. Okay, second item on the agenda is a section of the code that, or the charter that is, it's kind of been created over time. And so it needs some looking at, especially with an eye towards some of the changes that are taking place in our community and at the state. So why don't I pass it over to Nick from City Attorney and let him introduce, and we'll hear what they have to say on section 103.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you know, section 1.03 has a number of different subsections. So we've divided this up. The first part, Raul Aguila is going to present, which pertains to the sale or lease of specified city property. And then the second part pertains to increases in floor area ratio, which I will present to you. So Raul, if you'd like to kick off on the sale or lease.
Yep.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members. My name is Raul Aguila. For those of you that don't know me, I am a 30-year veteran of the City Attorney's Office. I just recently retired in 2022, and since 2014, I also had the privilege of serving as City Attorney for the city through my retirement. It's a pleasure to be here today because we're going to talk about section 1.03 of the city charter, which is one of the more popular provisions since it refers to the disposition of city property and or the lease of city property for more than 10 years. So it's one of the more, I would say, provisions that has been exercised frequently. You frequently see these matters on the ballot or in discussion in city commission meetings. And just as a point of personal privilege, I've dealt with the city charter provision for over 30 years since I've been at the city attorney's office, seen practically all the amendments to it since 1993. And I think it is probably time and due for a comprehensive cleanup of this section, since you may feel that a lot of the provisions may either be consolidated as you decide, strengthened or eliminated altogether. So as you go on with your comprehensive review of the city charter, I would urge you really to look at this provision in particular, because I think this charter review gives us a unique opportunity to bring this provision into the 21st century, shall we say. So before I get started with 1.03, which are the charter requirements that pertain to the sale or lease when you're talking about a lease of over 10 years of city property, I just want to talk about what's in the city code right now with respect to the disposition or lease of city property, and which are, in addition to the charter, which are the threshold and general requirements that we have to follow every time the city wants to either lease or sell a piece of city property. Those provisions are found in the handout that I gave you, which are located in Chapter 82 of the City Code, entitled Sale or Lease of Public Property. And it sets forth the minimum requirements that have to be considered by the City Commission For purposes of this discussion, since we're talking about leases in the charter, and those leases in the charter refer to leases of over 10 years, that's including option periods. So for example, if you have a 5-year lease and that 5-year lease includes a 5-year option to renew, then that, for the purposes of the charter, would be considered a 10-year lease. So I just want to focus on the requirements for selling city property and leasing city property of over 10 years. What the code currently requires when you're going to either sell or long-term lease city property is, number one, a recommendation before anything gets done, a transmittal by the city manager to the Finance and Citywide Projects Committee, for the committee to be able to consider it on a micro level and make a recommendation overall to the city commission. That recommendation is non-binding, but it does call for, before you do anything and there's a proposed lease or sale, the finance committee does have to discuss it and does have to review it. That's step one. Step two, when it makes it to the city commission, there are certain threshold requirements that have to be fulfilled before final approval. First of all, a proposed, and this goes for any sale or any lease of city property over 10 years. We're not talking about waterfront, park, we're talking about anything. So it has to be heard before the commission at 2 readings. The second reading has to be a public hearing, obviously with public input allowed before final determination is made. There also has to be, prior to final approval, an analysis by the city's planning department regarding the proposed lease or sale. And if you look at the handout, 82-38 takes into consideration what the planning department can consider. In other words, whether the proposed use or sale is in keeping with the comprehensive plan, how it affects the quality of life of the city, the impact on adjacent properties, etc. That has to be completed for consideration by the city commission as part of its final deliberation. Additionally, a sale or lease of city property has to generally be pursuant to an advertised public bidding process. That is, if we're going to lease or sell city property, the code requires that you either do a request for proposals or a request for qualifications regarding the proposed lease or sale. But if you're not going to do that, then the city commission can waive that requirement, but only by a 5/7 vote, supermajority vote of the city commission, and when they deem that waiving the requirement is in the best interest of the city. Secondly, lastly, you need an appraisal of the proposed lease or sale to see whether it's obviously whether the proposed lease or sale is within fair market value or has other benefits to the city to be considered. So 2 readings before the city commission, the final one being a public hearing, a planning department analysis, evaluating the proposed lease or sale, competitive bidding, unless you waive that by 5/7 vote of the city commission, and an appraisal. Yes, Mr. Goldberg.
It's not an option.
Regardless, the reason we do the appraisal is usually.
No, sorry. The question was,
I'm
I'm sorry,
sorry,
Mr. Goldberg.
competitive bidding.
is the competitive bid simply determined by highest price, or can other factors be considered in terms of choosing a bid?
Are you saying who does? Could you speak up, Mr. Goldberg? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah. When you say there's a competitive bidding process or an RFP, is the single criterion the price paid for the lot, or
No,
are
sir.
other factors considered?
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Goldberg. I didn't hear you.
Oh, no problem.
No. If it's a request for proposal or a request for qualifications, there could be other criteria besides price.
Okay.
We have had auctions
Mhm.
of city property. There were some vacant lots in North Beach that the city owned, which it auctioned off. So that was purely based on price. But we have also had, for example, the 72nd Street site was
RFP.
put out to request for proposals. In other words, there were other things besides price that the city wanted to see there. At one point, the city wanted to develop it as a cultural complex. The city in other instances may want retail components and affordable housing components. So no, price is not, if you competitively bid it, price is not the only determinative factor generally.
Great. That's very helpful. Thanks.
And those determinations, of course, are made by the city commission at the direction to the administration of how they want to set this out to bid. Ms. Latone.
Can you hear me okay? What is the standard for best interest of the city?
It's a legislative determination. It's a broad standard. For example, there have been instances where the city has initially entered into a lease with an operator. Let me just use an example, the Ronald Shane Water Sports Center, which was a lease that the city entered into where the Shane Water Sports Center actually built the center at its own expense and the city leased the land to it. When that lease expired, in that instance, the city commission determined that rather than send it out to bid for a new use or a new operator, and at the request in this case of the Shane, that they were doing such a good job and that the public purpose for the lease was so justified that in that case, the city commission waived the competitive bidding requirement and opted to negotiate with Shane directly. We've done the same thing in the past also for the Miami City Ballet. We own the ballet building, which we now lease to the ballet. Rather than at the end of the lease determine whether or not to use that building for a different purpose, the city has made determinations in the past to not put it out to bid and negotiate with the ballet directly. You're going to see that a lot in a lot of leases with a public purpose attached to them, where there's more than fair market value to be considered. So those are the type of things that the city takes into consideration when it waives competitive bidding. A good operator, a public purpose, a popular facility that hasn't garnered complaints. Those are criteria that the city can look at in determining not to bid it out, but to just continue to negotiate with the lessee.
Thank you.
Okay. Having explained to you what our code, the threshold requirements in our code, let's go to 103. Let's go to 103. 103 was established, and my experience with it goes as far back as 1993, which was at the same time that there was a charter review going on at the same time. So what this was meant to do was protect certain city properties, most notably city-owned parks and recreational facilities and and city-owned waterfront properties. But there was a determination made that because these properties were both for the public use and enjoyment and were also rare, that there be heightened conditions for their lease or sale other than what was set forth in Chapter 82. So if you look at 103A, this is the basic premise that we have now. The sale or lease of more than 10 years again, and that includes option periods, of park, recreation, or waterfront properties shall be subject to approval by a majority vote of the city in a citywide referendum. So in addition to all the requirements in Chapter 82, at the end of the day, if you're selling or long-term leasing, I'm just going to call it that, waterfront or park property, recreational property, then at the end of the day, you can't do it unless it's approved by referendum. Let me give you some past examples. The Jewish Community Center, which was a lease that the city entered into, which involved parkland. The JCC was going to build the facility and the city owned the land. The approval of the lease, because it was park, and I also believe because it was partly waterfront as well, was put out to a vote of the voters. Another example, more recent example. Yes, George.
Well, let me, I remember that situation. And I'm trying to recollect whether there was a distinction made between citywide referendum or a more condensed voter group. Do you
In
recall?
that case, thank you for
Describe why
reminding me,
the
because in that
distinction is
case,
in
there
that.
was. There's a county charter provision which is called Save Our Parks, which trumps the city charter to the extent that there shall be, the county charter says there shall be no non-park uses of park property. So in other words, if you're going to use a park with certain limited exemptions for a private purpose, then you have to put it out to a county-wide referendum. Unless, and in the case of the JCC, this was the case, when you're dealing with parks of a very limited size, of a minor size, I think in that case, it was under an acre or under 2 acres, then it would require you to have a referendum of all the voters in the precincts within, I think, 1 mile or 2 miles within the area. And that was the case with JCC. So you're right, that was a county charter referendum. Let me give you an example of a recent citywide referendum, the Miami Beach Marina. And I'm sure all of you saw that on the ballot in, I don't think it was the last election, but maybe the election before that. We own the Miami Beach Marina, as you know, which is a waterfront public marina, which is under a long-term lease to a private operator, but still operated as a public marina. There was a request by the marina operator, as some of you will recall, to extend or to enter into a new and amended marina, which would terminate the existing lease agreement and enter into a new lease with an extended term. This was also done concurrent to a request by a developer in tandem with the marina to develop a housing project at the marina site. So because that is public waterfront property owned by the city, and it is a lease of, it did anticipate a lease of over 10 years, that was put out to citywide referendum. To my knowledge, this happened after me, but the referendum failed. So the project did not go forward. Another one that was on a recent ballot that some of you may recall is the Smith and Wollensky restaurant in South Point Park. The Smith and Wollensky restaurant sits in South Point Park. It's a private use of a public recreational park. The original restaurant was approved prior to the city charter, to the city charter provision on leasing, leases of 10 years or more being inserted into the city charter provision. The initial provision was prohibiting the sale of waterfront or park property. And then in 2004, we added the provision of also requiring that leases of 10 years or more be subject to voter referendum of park, waterfront, and recreational property. Smith and Wollensky was pre-existing beforehand, but they had an extension coming up. Their lease was expiring and they wanted to extend their lease to keep the restaurant operating. That was put on the ballot for approval, and I believe that passed. So the lease extension was approved pursuant to majority of the voters.
How would that apply to Nikki Beach?
Good question. If you go back to chapter 82, and that's why I wanted to integrate chapter 82 here. When you look at 82-36, which talks about the lease of city property, if you look at it at the end of that, it talks about certain exceptions. And it says, for purposes of this article, the term lease shall not include, special event permits, revocable permits, concession agreements, convention center use agreements for short-term use of any of the city's cultural agreements for short-term use of the city's cultural and or parks and recreation facilities, and management and operation agreements. So what we have at Nikki Beach is a concession agreement. In other words, it's not a lease of city property. They do not have the rights of a lessor. The agreement that we have is allowing them to use city property under a concession, which is governed by contract and is revocable under terms and conditions under the contract. In other words, if we wanted to terminate the agreement for breach, it would be subject to provisions of the agreement. We would not have to, as is a lessee's right, we would not have to evict them in court. So there's express language in those agreements, in our concession and management agreements. And besides Nikki Beach, I'll mention others that are in parks and recreational facilities. The city's golf courses are under management agreements. They're managed by a property operator, but they are not leased to the operator. The city's concession agreements, besides Nikki Beach, the beachside concession agreements are under a concession agreement. They have the right to use, but those rights are terminable under a contract. We don't lease city property. And in that case, we can't lease beach property in that case because we don't own the beach property. We take it, we use it from the state pursuant to a beachfront management agreement. The tennis centers are another example. All of these are governed under management and concession agreements as opposed to lease agreements. So they don't fall under this. Well, you've gotten ahead of me. They fall under a different scrutiny in the charter. Because, and I guess I'll just jump ahead because Ms. Latone asked the question.
Sorry.
But that's okay. It's okay. There's a lot of interlapping with this. So we're just going to have a nice, relaxed discussion about this because there's going to be lots of questions. There was a commissioner who historically felt that management and operation agreements like that, like the one you mentioned, as well as the golf course, the city's beach concessions, the tennis centers, things that we were likely, the Fillmore, things that we were likely enter into long-term agreements for, again, 10 years, a 10-year agreement, that those had to come under some type of scrutiny besides the requirements in Chapter 82. So they created the section under, and if you look at 103F, providing that operation, management, and concession agreements, while not subject to referendum approval, needed to be approved by a 4/7 vote of all members of the planning board and a 6/7 vote of the commission. Therefore, it's not the approval under Chapter 82, which if you're not waiving anything, conceivably can be done by majority vote. It's not a referendum requirement, but because these long-term agreements of city facilities, some of them in parks and some of them waterfront, were equally important, then let's create a requirement for them that while not a referendum, will add a heightened level of scrutiny. So we have the 4/7 planning board and the 6/7 city commission.
So under what conditions or who would be the determining party that would terminate a long-term concession agreement if not for breach? And
Those
what would be a scenario?
Those agreements would be covered by the agreement, the contracts themselves. And generally what those contracts provide is some of these agreements actually, but you won't see that in the longer term agreements, are terminable by either party without cause. But where they're not, and generally in the longer term agreements, you won't see that because generally these operators or concessionaires are investing money in these facilities to keep these facilities at first class quality, and also they may be giving back public benefits to the city. So the termination is usually based upon a breach, failure to pay rent, or failure to observe any of the conditions in the agreement. And if for example, if there is a breach, then you send them notice, you provide them a time to cure, and if they don't cure, then you can proceed to terminate. What's different about that than a lease is that in a lease, you expressly have rights under state statute which provide that you can't just be terminated, you actually have to be evicted.
So it's sort of
So-
a loophole,
Right. Oh,
a little bit.
yes, call it a loophole, but
It's a way
the-
to get
the-
around it.
the distinction between whether it's a lease or whether it's a concession or operating agreement has to be set forth in the contract. Generally, somebody that has rights under an operation or concession agreement does not have the property, will not have the property rights vested under a lease. So like Miami City Ballet, for example, or the Shane Water Sports Center, which actually built these multi-million-dollar facility. Again, the JCC built these multi-million-dollar facilities on city land.
So if you keep renewing them, do they not have to go back out for, I mean, like, don't they
No,
have to go back out for?
no,
Okay,
when
because
no,
Okay.
you go by the term in the agreement. So for example, in the golf course, let's say I went out to bid on that in 1996 with an operator with a 10-year term. Come 2006, when the term expires, I either have to make a determination on whether I want to go out to bid on that for a new operator or whether I want to waive competitive bidding, as I said, because it's a good operator, because the operator, has made certain, is going to make certain improvements to the property, wants to sweeten the deal, so to speak. But at the end of that term, the city commission will always have to determine whether it wants to go out to bid on that or whether it wants to waive competitive bidding and negotiate with the existing operator or concessionaire. And I believe you just had that come up with, I'm no longer here, but I do follow what's going on in Miami Beach because I did the original Nikki Beach concession in 1990 something.
that's why
So
it
I
seems,
understand that came up again, and there was a determination on whether or not to go out to bid or to waive competitive bidding. And I think the ultimate resolution has been to go out to bid on it.
That's right.
Raul, so are the city golf courses considered parkland?
The golf course?
Yeah, golf courses.
The golf course is, it not only, the charter not only includes parks, but it includes recreational facilities.
Okay,
So the golf course is considered a recreational facility, yes.
and can, because one of the things I heard posed by a commissioner here a while ago was that we would take the golf courses and turn them into a resiliency sites.
I heard that too.
And I wondered whether or not that was something that would require voter approval. How does that play in?
Yeah.
Where you're
If-
changing
Let me
the
just clarify
use?
your question, Ron. I don't remember what the proposal was. Was it to kind of turn the golf courses into stormwater retention ponds kind of stuff? Or
Yeah,
Was it?
yeah,
private?
parks with stormwater retention.
Right, but that still would remain a public park in that instance, or were they suggesting?
Well, it's a
private
well,
developer?
again, this is question. It's not a park, it's a recreational facility. So,
Correct.
so how does that play?
So let's say, remember, what our charter governs is sale or lease. All right, so if a city, for example, let's say that the city commission, which owns the golf course, decided we don't want a golf course anymore. We're still going to own it, but we're going to turn it into something else. Under our charter, that would not require a referendum because we're not talking about a sale or lease. We're talking about the city with
Change
its
of use.
property deciding how to use it. So now there would be a number of other items that would have to be considered to do that. I'm sure there are lots of planning items and ample discussion. But to answer your question, would that fall into the referendum requirement? No, because our referendum requirement contemplates when you sell or when you convey or transfer to somebody else.
So if the city
whether it's
wanted
by sale or by
to
lease,
develop housing there and have a private developer develop
that
housing.
would require
that
a
would
referendum
require
because
a
chances
referendum.
are you're going to sell it to a developer.
Correct. Or lease it long-term or some other. yeah.
Right.
so the big difference is a concession agreement doesn't require voter approval. Is that right?
No, it does not. A concession agreement requires 4/7 planning board.
Right.
and 6/7 commission approval.
Thank you.
And I believe in recent history, we've had some of our concessions, our concession agreements have gone before the planning board and the city commission.
That's right.
And I'm thinking of the golf course, and others.
And also the beachfront concessions have gone
Right,
to
the
the,
beach
to the
concession
planning board
agreement.
and the city.
So no,
commission.
but
Also-
those don't require referendum.
You also, I think, have a management agreement. Didn't we do something like that with Unidad in North Beach? Or the MDPL auditorium where they're
Yes,
like
MDPL,
right.
which MDPL was one of the last things I worked on before I left. And because their term had expired and for the 10th Street Auditorium, which is in a park. It's in Loomis Park.
Right. How does that exactly work? Because they get paid by the city, but then it's not, that's
Yeah,
a
that's a
really,
management
that's a
agreement.
Okay.
right?
Well,
thank you.
I knew you were going to have questions and this is great. So can I just, let me just,
Go back to your
yeah,
order.
let me just
and
go
we'll get to-
go back in order and we can continue, feel free to interrupt me whenever you want, because this is exactly what we wanted to come out of charter review, and this is what you're supposed to be doing. So thank you. It's very energizing. So, okay. So now we know, just to say it again, that waterfront, park or recreational facilities, sale or long-term lease, 10 years or more, is subject to referendum. Now, and I think this was during Mr. Gonzalez's time, in 103B number 2, section 2, the city commission said, okay, well, besides park and recreation or waterfront, there are certain properties in the city that are really important just as well, even though they may not be in a park or they may not be waterfront properties. So you know what? I want the sale or lease of those to also be subject to referendum. So the city commission, and this was a while back ago, but in subsection B2, you'll see that the city commission identified certain properties which they believe to be critical. They include the West Lots in North Beach, the Collins Park Cultural Campus, where we have the Bass Museum, and of course, where we have Collins Park, the 72nd Street parking lot, the Lincoln Road parking lots, which abut Lincoln Road, and then we'll deal with the next one, the convention center, shortly. Right. So the city said these aren't park, these aren't waterfront, but they're just as important to us, so that if we decide to do something with them in the future, any lease or sale has to be subject to referendum. And you've seen this. I believe recently on your ballot, you had an agreement regarding a commercial project on the Lincoln Road lots that was put on the ballot for approval, since it involved, I believe, a ground lease of city property, and it failed. So the project did not go forward. I don't believe we put the 72nd Street lots on the ballot yet because we haven't gone far enough, but I know that at least when I was here, all the projects that we were working on, if they involved a sale or a ground lease of that property, it would be subject to referendum as well. Same goes for Collins Park. If any of the, and Collins Park doesn't just include Collins Park, but it includes that parking lot on the beach side where the W and whatever, the Bulgari or whatever are there,
Right.
It include that parking lot. So at that point, the city commission said, well, if we were ever to do something with regard to, that we might want to sell this property to a developer, then, that's something that we want to see subject to referendum. So this is a provision that has been there a while. I put to you whether you think it's necessary to still have it in there, whether it needs to be updated. To my knowledge, it's never been updated except as follows, and I'll jump into the next one, which is subsection 3. At around the time, and Mr. Gonzalez is very familiar with this, that we were in our first go round deciding how to develop the convention center campus, which initially pursuant to the first RMB involved not only the contemplation of the convention center being rehabbed, but a convention center hotel, and maybe throwing City Hall and the 1701 building into the mix. So it included kind of like the rehabilitation of a campus. That RFP, although not going forward, prompted a discussion with regard to at the time that we were going through the convention center expansion and the convention center hotel, which are currently, the expansion's done and the hotel's underway. But at that time, there was a concern, well, this is prime city property. So let's talk about this convention center campus and whether we want to add it to the list of these heightened properties. And when we talk about the convention center campus, if you look at your sub 3, we talk about the convention center parking lots, which was the surface lot that is now Pride Park, as well as the parking lots that are to the side where the 555 building is. We also talk about the convention center campus, which talks about all the city-owned property except for the convention center and the Carl Fisher Clubhouse, located within the convention center, and it includes City Hall and the 1701 Meridian building, which is also, by the way, owned by the city, as well as the 555 17th Street building, which is owned by the city next to the Fillmore. It includes the Fillmore. And also, and Elizabeth, you made a great comment in your email to me, the 21st Street Community Center, which I'm told no longer exists. So if something needs updating, you have it there. But it included this cluster of properties as well. So this was brought forth by Commissioner Wolfson, and it was during the time of all the deliberations regarding the convention center expansion and the convention center hotel. And his referendum question was like, look, this is a prime piece of city property. It's very important to me, and I think the voters, to how it gets developed. So if we're going to do a sale or lease of more than 10 years in any of these particular properties, and certainly a lease of the convention of any land for a convention center hotel, a ground lease would be more than 10 years, then I not only want it to go out to referendum, I want it to be a 60% voter approval requirement, not 50, but 60. And as you know, our convention center hotel, when it did go out to referendum, it was subject to 60% voter approval, which was a very hard threshold to make, but it did in fact get approved by a 60% majority. So this is another provision along with the prior properties that I mentioned that I want you to think about, as to, especially with regard to the 60% requirement. So many of these provisions were put in, as is rightly so, because of circumstance and what was happening at the time. The lease of 10-year or more requirement came as a result of there was a development of a lot of city-owned land for ground leases for private parking lots, private public parking deals like the Anchor Garage, the 13th Street Garage on Collins, the Lincoln Road Garage on Michigan and 17th. So these provisions essentially came after the fact, in order, and the one that I'm talking about with regard to the convention center, obviously came in the midst of the convention center hotel, which is now going up. So, these are things I asked you as a board to think about when you're making your recommendations, but this is how it stands now.
Are you aware of any situations where the city has made leases for, say, 9 years, 364 days to get around the 10-year threshold?
Not with leases or sale, because when you're talking about these type of leases, particularly, let me give you the convention center hotel as an example. There was no way. I mean, they were leasing city property, and there was no way that they were going to be able to build and finance a multi-million-dollar convention center hotel to the standards that we required with a management or operating agreement. No lender would give them financing based upon that. So they had to evidence that they had a ground lease which vested them with certain rights. So I can tell you that there's been no loopholes with regard to these provisions. They're pretty clear cut. And all in all, I think they've been used in the past. They certainly haven't sat in the charter without just collecting dust. But I think now, since you're doing your 10-year charter review, maybe it's, and I know that I've talked to some of you separately, and I know there is an interest in many of you in 1.03. So I think it's stuff you want to look at, and if you want to go stricter, that's your prerogative. That is solely up to you. But I think that this is a charter provision that, because it's been, because provisions have been added as a result of circumstance, that you may want to revisit it. So I think it's a great time to do that. Just skipping over, we discussed I'm sorry, Michael.
That's okay. It seems to me that the revisions, if we were to proceed with that, would be to exercise our prerogative to make it more consistent. Move it all to 60% for vote, or move it down from 60 to a majority vote. Are there any other properties out there which might fall into this or not?
That's a good question, because going back to section 3, some of these properties are still in play. The west lot certainly are. That's one of the last undeveloped pieces of city property. And we saw that the Lincoln Road lots obviously are currently in play. Some of these the Fillmore and the Jackie Gleason is still there as well. Some of these properties, the convention center parking lots and the convention center campus, I don't know. That to me is something, for the board to deliberate on. I think also, just generally speak. So it depends on what you decide to do with 103, whether you just decide to put it all under a general provision saying, not distinguishing, between park, waterfront, or this property versus another, and just say all city property or leases of 10 years or more shall be subject to referendum. That's within your purview. And that's why we have you looking at this. I'm not here to make any suggestions whatsoever. I'm just the scribe.
Yeah,
and the
Michael, I think
historian in this
that's,
case. Mr.
it's
Raven has a question.
oh, I'm sorry. Oh, Sam, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on the question about any leases that were like 10 or 9 years and 364 days. The concessions, at least in the case of Nikki Beach, seems to have operated like a lease, but not called a lease. I mean, they've had that property for decades.
Yes.
But for the fact it's called a lease, it seemed like it operated as one. Would you think that it might be advisable to have some kind of a time limit on concessions to avoid them falling into the purview of a lease, but not called a lease?
And if I understand you, a time limit with the same operator.
Yes.
I think that's a great suggestion. I think that's a great suggestion, because I will tell you, in my history of being here, which is 30 years, I have seen so-called good operators benefit from being good operators and being given the virtue of long-term, what you would call long-term management and concession agreements, simply because they're good, they're good at what they do. But as a devil's advocate, you could call that a monopoly, or even so it's a question I guess the commission considers in its business sense as well. But I think that that's something that you could definitely consider if you want to make the restrictions in the charter stricter and maybe more competitive.
Yeah. And competing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they lose. I remember a situation with the Segafredo on Lincoln.
Yes.
That we put out to bid after a period of time, and they competed. Now they had competition, and lo and behold, in order for them to secure the victory again, their rents tripled, because that's how under market it was. And they won. They were good operators and they were recommended. And so it doesn't move them out necessarily, but it certainly improves the village or the city's.
And I think that's the point. I think that we're not looking to eliminate them if they're a good operator. And I think it also creates incentive for them to continue to be good operators or to improve their operation, so that there's not discontent to then seek to remove.
Sure.
But just.
And I see the point,
real quick,
Mr.
though,
Raven, that you're making and that Elizabeth has made. I just want to touch on it
All right.
before Brian, that the waiver of competitive bidding in order to negotiate with a operator or a concessionaire or a lessee, it should be viewed as an extraordinary remedy, because whenever possible, competition is good. And the city wants to encourage competitive bidding. And a competitor always puts the incumbent on its mettle. You know, so the idea is if you've got competition, well, then I need to be, you know, on my toes to continue to provide the services that I'm known for, or else I'm just not going to be guaranteed that I'm going to get this. So, you know, in considering a waiver of competitive bidding, we should always treat that as an extraordinary remedy because the end should always be to competitively bid it.
But could you make the opposite argument, though, that in order to be a best of breed operator, you need to invest in your building, invest in your restaurant, get the latest equipment?
Right.
My concern here is you know, as many people here, I'm a lover of capitalism and a true capitalist here, but I also know that if you want to build and improve a space and actually provide a great product and service to thousands or millions of people, you need to invest sometimes millions or tens of millions of dollars up front. If you're going to have the land grabbed out from under you after 3 years, you're not going to get that financed.
And Brian, that rationale is exactly the rationale that's prevailed sometimes, particularly when you're talking about periodic upgrades to the city's beach concessions, which are not cheap.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think we all agree that we have some of the best beach concessions in the county. You know, the golf courses, which, you know, which we have had an operator that has been there for some time, but has made significant financial investments in the property to keep it at that first class standard that we want. Same thing with the tennis courts. So that's, you know, to argue the opposite end of the coin, that has played out historically.
What would be helpful here, and touch on what led into the conversation, what are some examples of poorly operated concessions where people said, hey, those guys really dropped the ball? You know, we were excited to bring them in 3 years ago, but the operations are festering and we're not happy with the service, and man, we'd love to get them out.
I don't want to editorialize here, but just in terms of what I've dealt with as a transactions attorney, the tennis centers.
Tennis centers were one that I know went through a switch over.
Yeah, it behooved the city tremendously to bid out the tennis center contract from a long time, which was held by a longtime operator, and then subsequently, I think, taken over through a competitive bidding process by Green Square or Bollettieri. Bollettieri. You know, the city, that had a positive effect. And, you know, the fact that those, you know, so the tennis center is probably the one that I can
For
cite
many
to.
years, Penrod's operated the beach concessions, not just Nikki Beach. And then it was switched over to Boucher Brothers.
Right.
That was probably 20 years ago now, but that's another example. I'm not suggesting Penrod's was a bad operator, it's just the concession ran and an RFP was put out and competition ensued.
You know, and again, I'm not an expert on beaches, having only lived here a few years, but it would feel that the amount of upfront investment
Correct.
Infrastructure and TI for a
Much
beach
less.
is much less
Much
than
less.
building
No.
a golf clubhouse or something.
I think both of you can be correct. I think Sam said 3 years. He didn't put a number. It could be a limit that is financially feasible and practical.
I think there's an important difference between the golf courses, for example, and the beach concessions. The golf courses are really more of a management agreement. The city sets the rates, the city makes the money, the city, if there's a capital improvements needed, the city pays for those, not the operator. They do get like a bonus if they get if the revenue is high, you know, because, you know, they've done a good job and so on. But that's very different from the concession where they pay like a fixed amount and then they keep whatever profit pretty much that they make, right?
Right.
That was going to be sort of leads into this question. How does the rent, is it tied to CPI? Is it some sort of,
Negotiation.
is it just some sort of adjustment, like a 3% per
Yes.
year? How does that
The
reset?
rent is, and that's why our concession agreements usually, we've kept them, you know, at best, I think, to a 5-year agreement with a 5-year renewal, because you can renegotiate, you know, revenues. But besides, the rents are based upon a percentage of gross, and they do include CPI adjusters. Now, I want you also to focus that because we're a public corporation,
Right.
and not a private corporation, money is not the only bottom dollar. Because, you know, when your golf course facilities and your tennis facilities and your beach concessions are less than quality, you hear it from the residents. So it's not always also about money. It's also about, and I know that the city has very much, in addition to revenue, the city has very much put it upon their operators and concessionaires to periodically upgrade facilities by spending a capital investment
Right.
in doing that. Also with regard to public benefits in terms of discounts for Miami Beach residents, for seniors, for kids and park programs. So there are other things. Revenue, of course, is important, but there are other things to be considered beside revenues. But that's also, like I said, that's also the incentive for keeping these leases at a 5 and 5 max and not entering into these long-term
lease.
leases where you can't do anything.
Roll, I think what would be helpful for the group, and maybe you guys can pull this and send it separately, is if you can kind of inventory the leases that exist, the concession agreements that exist.
Over 10 years, George?
Yeah,
Okay.
over the 10 years, management agreements that exist, any of these examples. So
Sure.
let's get a universe of what we're talking about. Are we talking about a handful of these, or are we talking about 100 of these?
That's right.
And that might help us inform how we might approach
We can provide that.
handling these going forward, because I think it's not a lot. It's more than we think, but it's not hundreds of
It
them.
is not.
You know, but it would be good to kind of by category. And then the next thing, pose a question with a statement, and
Right.
that is that I suspect that if we were crafting this charter starting from a blank slate, we probably wouldn't write it this way.
Probably not.
This has evolved over the years as things came up, and 72nd Street came up. We're not going to let that happen again. Let's pass a
exactly right.
referendum change, and the convention center, we're not going to let that one happen again. And so I'd almost want to see if we were starting from scratch, what it might look like. And then from that perspective, there's two ways to approach it. It's either we're going to allow it unless these exceptions, or we're not going to allow it unless these exceptions.
I think we should
Yeah.
clean it. I think we should clean it up. But I mean, as a practical matter, I mean, if we're just looking at sort of the culture of how things get done in Miami Beach now, it feels like feels like there's not a lot of land left in play. It feels like if anyone wants to put a fingerprint on it, the voters all rise up and demand a voice in the matter. I mean, I don't
No,
think.
I understand, but I'm saying, that's what I'm saying is, rather than trying to let someone try to figure out, well, bounded by what street and in which block and whatever, just kind of say everything, and then here are your exceptions.
Can I?
Ron's trying to get it.
Yeah. One other thing, Raul, I wondered if you think this would make sense or not. With the zoning, we talked about sort of switching to a form-based zoning. Instead of having just verbiage, it goes on and on and on, that it's more like a table or a chart.
Mhm.
And so you can see much more
Mhm.
easily and not try to find point A, whatever. Is that something that you think would make sense to look at for provisions like this in the charter?
I think that's something that this board.
For
would
the
definitely
zoning or for this?
consider.
For this?
Oh, okay.
Because
think
in other words, we've done it for zoning. We did a
Good.
lot of work on the zoning, which used to be just like this, it's
Yeah.
sort of this.
My initial comment to this board was, and I don't, again, I'm not here to do that, but just as somebody, as a point of personal privilege, as somebody that's been looking at this for 30 years and saying, well, I think that this is a great opportunity to simplify this provision and maybe make it, whether it's stricter or I'm not talking about whether you make it stricter, but make it simple so that it's more user friendly.
That's where I'm going, Rose, is,
Right.
I'm not sure that there's too much of a distinguishing between the West Lots and the 41st Street corridor, or a waterfront bounded or not waterfront bounded, or is it an alley? Because we've seen all of these gymnastics over how we've determined that
Yes.
it wasn't waterfront.
Yes.
Because there was a road 500 years ago. And so it might be better for us to approach it from all right, everything is treated the same.
I agree.
Here are the exceptions. And these exceptions either are more or less restrictive, or do or don't require the referendum. But I'd suggest that we kind of approach it
I
from
think I
let's start
actually
over.
said that
Yeah.
earlier today.
Let's start over.
I appreciate that. And I think what you said, George, with regard to every provision in here is the result of some historical circumstance. And some of those may not be in play anymore. And as you said, Brian, there's not a lot of city property left, that's as you put it in play, but everything is here because of a reason
There was
that may not be valid anymore.
in the last year or two, if I'm not mistaken, there was a what otherwise would be a single family lot
Right,
that somehow the city
Right.
came to own
right,
somewhere along the way that happened to be waterfront.
right.
And
And
it
I'm in no way
Required a
suggesting,
referendum.
right, and I'm in no way suggesting that, because this is your prerogative, that you be more
More or
lenient
less. Sure.
That's up to you. I'm just saying that, in this case, less might be more.
Mhm.
I'm-
Or
Sorry, may
I'm
I
sorry,
jump
go
in?
ahead, Julie.
Hi.
applies in the
thank you.
conversation.
Thank you, by the way, for this, all of this information. It is quite an education. And I am in favor of simplifying and maintaining some degree of consistency, but should we decide, for example, to maintain the distinction between, management and operation agreements, concession agreements, et cetera, from the standard, I guess? And I think I know the answer to this question, but has there ever been an oversight committee that is, or has it ever come up as a, way to sort of monitor what these sort of limitless agreements, how they're being managed over time? I mean, as opposed to, I think what's happening now is that until there's cause for concern, everybody kind of just looks the other way. It seems like that's what, what's happened historically, but I think that everybody should have an opportunity to be reviewed and evaluated, and I don't know, it's just another way to look at it as opposed to providing, term limits, for example.
Right. At some point, and again, Mr. Manager, you'll remember this. We had an audit committee. And the audit committee was convened it was headed by, there was a forensic accountant. And it was convened to help us develop better contract procedures. As far as an overview about, there was, as a matter of fact, with regard to terms, the terms used to be longer on management and operation agreements, for example. And that was not, we used to have management agreements with 10-year terms, 15-year terms, where you were basically locked in to a set of conditions without really being able to move. And I remember that was one of the helpful things that came out of the audit committee was, shorter terms. Maybe that needs to be looked at again. What I'm kind of gleaning here is, this distinction between sale and lease, which received the highest scrutiny, sale and lease of waterfront, park, and recreational facilities, and then management agreements, which of 10-year term or over, which are not subject to referendum, but which are subject to a higher level than what would be in Chapter 82, a 6/7 vote rather than a 4/7 or 5/7 vote. So, but as far as that was the only thing that I can tell you, Ms. Bassner, with regard to the terms, and that audit committee was a long time ago.
Yeah. And now I'll tell you that there's a finance committee that should do that oversight. Your manager is responsible for that stuff. And so, and I guess now with the Inspector General, there's another set of eyes that might be available to
Right.
look at those kinds of things.
Right.
But, that said, whatever committee might review, it's what we establish as our recommendations for what's a management agreement, what's a concession, how long, those kinds of things that, I guess we would kind of weigh in on. And I'm at least I'm one vote here, but I would be of the opinion, if we were to start over and write it differently,
Right.
what would it be looking like? And I'd ask you guys to,
Just to
Explore
add to
that,
what
yeah.
you said, Ms. Bassner, we kind of, and I know George remembers this because when we worked on a revamp of Chapter 82, we kind of established the cutoff point between short-term and long-term leases at 10 years. And because you have the city as a landlord in Old City Hall in the 7-7 building. We have short-term leases that are 3 an office, 2 years with a 1-year option, 3-year with a 2-year option. That's fairly common. But when you get into the territory of 10 years, whether it's a 5-year initial term with a 5-year renewal, you're dealing with something in the longer term where generally, as you said, the operator or the lessee is going to invest some
That's
money.
more.
in upgrading the facility. So that was kind of where
That
we,
was what we
the
struggled
last
with.
cutoff point was 10 years, to answer your
And,
question.
and one of the things that I was going to ask you guys to explore along with this is that very thing is when we are a lessor, we're the landlord on these facilities, the ground floor of retail space,
Right.
that space, I'm not as concerned with
Mhm.
the kind of scrutiny that we're talking about vis-a-vis giving away the north lots to somebody to go develop something.
Right.
And we should carve those out differently. And it may be that it's still the right thing. 10 years, it may be that it's something different,
Yeah,
but those are intended to be leased. I mean, those are, we require any public garage to have ground floor leased and
Yes.
activate. And then we're going to tie our hands to these limitations that doesn't allow us to get a good tenant in there,
right,
like the Symphony Garage that has never really had a good tenant,
right,
probably because our laws don't allow it.
right. And I think
somewhere.
that's where we came up with that 10-year cutoff.
Right.
I don't want to fix what's not broken.
Mm.
And I don't want to micromanage. I don't think that's our job. But Raul has given us some great examples anecdotally about what's going on. And I think George's suggestion is apt that let's look at this universe. Let's
Mhm.
kind of figure out what's going on and what needs to be changed, if anything,
Mhm.
in all of this. And if the constituency, the residents of Miami Beach think it's a 60% is better than a mere majority, we might want to listen to that. But I don't think we're prepared at this juncture to move forward with the rewrite until we get more information.
Mhm.
And that's kind of my
Yep.
view about.
I was,
where we are with
Mr.
this.
Chairman, before Mr. Goldberg speaks, can I just, can we provide that, that email, that additional stuff you asked by email? to the
Sure,
committee?
email, and listen, it is safe
The
to say.
inventory.
Yeah, no, it's safe to say that I'm hearing that, this needs some attention and it should be on the list of, yeah, we're gonna work on this. That's information that I would like to see. I'm sure
Okay,
you all
we can do
get
that.
from that.
It's important.
Is there anyone from the city, though, that will get this tranche of information that can maybe explain it if I have a question about a given lease or a concession or
Yeah,
whatever?
legal here will be available, whether
We're
it's
gonna call
Raul
Nick.
or.
We're
or
gonna
Nick.
call
Well,
And we can also,
Legal's great, but I'm more concerned with the idea that maybe someone in administration
Oh.
said, this is good, this is bad, this is working for us, this is not
That's,
working.
yeah,
Right.
that's the kind of stuff that I was talking about to have.
So yeah, what we can do is we can have the asset management team here when you all are ready to discuss the list. So if it's at your next meeting, you let me know and we'll do that.
Okay.
Okay,
We don't have a problem. We won't have a
Yeah.
problem providing that. That's easy.
Is there
fine.
anything
Oh,
else
sorry.
relative to 103 that you want to make
Yes,
sure we cover?
So,
or
so
anybody-
just in closing out 103 sale and lease, because we've got a few other things to cover and I'm sorry I've taken up so much of your time. The sale or lease, finally, if you look at subsection 4, the sale or lease of any remaining city-owned property. And again, we're talking about sale or leases of over 10 years is subject to 4/7 planning board approval and 6/7 city commission approval. So what I'll tell you that what this generally covers is most of our ground
actually it
leases
says 7/8.
and air rights leases. For example, when the city has entered into
RDA, that's
development
when it's the
agreements.
redevelopment agency.
What?
That's when it's the redevelopment agency that it's the 7/8 vote. 'Cause you
Yeah,
have
the
an
reason we
additional
did the
member.
redevelopment was because its voting requirement is different now. Because they have a county commission member on it.
For any RDA stuff.
Yeah, the RDA stuff. That's why
Okay.
that's why we had to separate that. But I'll tell you what this provision deals with. A lot of the development agreements that we've done, which involve a portion of city property, the public-private parking garages, which are usually on city land, ground leased on city lands, any kind of ground lease that we've entered, New World Symphony, which involves a ground lease. So these aren't park, these aren't waterfront, but most of these are leases of over 10 years. Because they're ground leases, so they're long-term leases. We're talking 40-year leaseholds. These would require planning board scrutiny and heightened city commission scrutiny.
Those are the examples that I'm saying that might just require a referendum and just call it a day. Everything's a
Correct.
referendum.
Correct.
And if I could just add that the city clerk made a great suggestion, which is the North Beach redevelopment agency
Right.
is not referenced in the charter. So that may be something that
All right.
as part of any
Agreed.
cleanup, we include.
Right. Forgot about that.
Same, you got to change the name of North Shore Open Space Park. I noticed there's a new name for
Right.
that park. Raul, going down here to section D, I think this is a recent change as well.
Vacations.
Is this the vacation and
Okay.
the FAR that goes with the vacation or something?
Sure. So sections D and E we can take together because those involve requirements for vacation of city property. For those of you that don't know what a vacation is, the city either owns or has an easement interest, a public right-of-way easement interest in several right-of-ways throughout the city. There have been requests historically throughout to vacate those right-of-ways. So the law provides that when you vacate a public right-of-way, then you can't sell it. It goes half and half to the adjacent property owners. So let's say, for argument's sake, let's say I have a public right-of-way that I either have an easement interest in or that I own. There's a hotel here and there's a hotel here. Well, the hotels come to me and they say, wouldn't it be nice? We really don't use this right-of-way. Wouldn't it be nice to turn this into a park, a public park city? And, in addition to that, I'm going to give you other public benefits that, you're really not using this street end. So wouldn't it be nice to vacate it? When the city gets a request like that for a vacation, it has to go through certain procedures. Same procedures usually in Chapter 82. It has to get an appraisal to see what the vacated property is worth. It also has to do a planning department analysis to see what the impact of that vacation will be. And it has to go before the city commission at a public hearing. So those are the general requirements for vacation. These are heightened requirements that were put into the charter as a result of circumstance. Again, the first one, which is D, talks about vacation of public right-of-ways ending in a public beach. And the way that we describe that is the right-of-way extends eastward from Collins Avenue or Ocean Drive to the erosion control line. So in that case, that needs to be approved by referendum unless it's less than 10% of the right-of-way. So I'm going to give you the example that I know a lot of you are thinking about and some of the exceptions that have been in the charter, which were recently closed in a charter amendment brought forward by Commissioner Rosen Gonzalez, which would close that loophole. But let's talk about the property at 8701 Collins, the David Suarez property, and the street end next to it.
David Martin.
David Martin.
David Martin.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't even be using his name, but it's how we all know the property we're talking about, right?
Yes.
So
entirely.
next to that property, there was a right-of-way which seemingly ended at the beach. And so there was a request by the developer to vacate this right-of-way. There were discussions with regard to the public benefits to the city to vacate it. And eventually the right-of-way, by the way, was vacated. And there was a $10 million public contribution made towards North Shore Open Space Park, whatever. The question arose, well, if this street end ends at the beach, why wasn't this subject to referendum? Why was it done administratively? And let's remember that administratively, the requirement was because this is a vacation of city property and the ultimate what ultimately happens when you vacate city property is it goes to the adjacent property owners, which he owned, by the way, properties on both sides. So it would have gone to him in fee simple. It's essentially described as a conveyance. And you'll see that D talks about the sale, exchange, conveyance, lease, or any transfer of any city interest. So we were essentially conveying this right of way to him. So what does that trigger? That triggers 103.4, which requires 6/7 city commission vote and 4/7 planning board approval. The reason this was not done subject to referendum, and we saw this in two properties, which I'll mention, and I was the city attorney during this. It was, it was a very, very interesting legal analysis, was that this right of way, what we subsequently found when we did the title search, there was an intervening property owned by the county. So therefore, you're going along the right of way, the county owns part of the right of way, and then the city's interest in the right of way continues. So technically, this right of way did not end at the erosion control line, or
Waterfront.
it did not qualify as a waterfront right of way. So it was vacated administratively as opposed to referendum. In addition, there was a benefit received by the developer. In addition to the vacation, the developer was able to aggregate that property, since if we vacated it, it would be owned by the developer. The developer could aggregate it onto its development site, onto creating a unified development site, and therefore being able to take advantage of more FAR for its project. So this was a very controversial opinion during my tenure. We had two of these. We had 8701, and we also had the vacation of Ocean Terrace
Ocean Terrace, yeah.
for a North Beach development project that I understand is still going on.
Right.
And because of the fact that there were both intervening properties, so that it didn't necessarily qualify for waterfront. And I think when you're talking about simplifying the charter, you're talking about maybe, I'm guessing, closing up these little things and just making it easier, so that, there was a bit of legal scrutiny with this one, as well as the FAR. If you vacate the right of way, then the developer can aggregate it into his development site, and it becomes part of a unified development site, which is not subject to an increased FAR referendum for increased FAR, since that provision, which Nick is going to talk about, excludes unified development
Wasn't
sites.
there a referendum in the last year or so
It
on
was
the?
21st Street.
No, it had to do with Ocean Terrace and some of these
Oh,
others, but
that was-
which
that was-
category does that fall into? Is
that
that
was
D?
That was the
The
part-
Ocean Terrace one, the one about vacating the land and taking the FAR and
Yes,
putting it into the building. Is
Right,
that
but I'm talking about why these weren't treated as waterfront.
No, I got it, but where would that new referendum language appear here?
Oh,
Is that
okay.
section
It's
D?
actually
It's in 103C.
It's in 103C,
C,
which
okay.
generally relates more to FAR than it does
Okay.
to the sale or lease of city property, but there's an exception there for the vacation of a right of way if it would result in
An
the
increase.
aggregation of floor area across unified abutting parcels.
So this
That's
is,
my confusion.
this is
Huh?
sort of,
That's why this should be simplified.
Yes.
is that-
right, this is sort of to both of you. So I don't have my email in front of me, but I think you all got it. But there was an alley, I think it was Alton Alley, that was I guess unified, it was vacated and it unified.
Alton Court, yes.
That's
Mhm.
correct. Alton, Alton Court.
500 Alton.
So,
Oh,
so it was, so my question is, why would we not include easements and or alleyways in this type of thing? Because what happens is it actually does unify those properties, and this happens all the time. And
Right.
I'm trying to, this is sort of goes to both of you, so.
So
I'll tell
that,
you why we didn't, I can tell you why we didn't include easements. And I think right of ways is included when you look at the general definition of all of these, which says the sale, exchange, conveyance, lease, or any transfer of any city interest. I think there you're talking about, even if it's not city owned and the city, because a lot of these times we don't own the right of way, but we have a public right of way easement. So that is a city interest in it. But the reason we didn't include easement, vacation of easements in
Mhm.
general, was there was a lot of administrative concern with that, because we negotiate easements above and below ground all the time with a lot of public entities,
Sure.
utilities, with FDOT when they're doing a right of way project where they want a short-term easement for staging. So the definition of easement was problematic, and we were worried that it could be too broadly interpreted. And we certainly didn't want that every time we conveyed an easement to have to be subject to a referendum requirement. So I can tell you that that's why easements were not included. But we thought that that was captured when we talked about city interest, because had we had a public right-of-way interest ending at the water, we would not be able to vacate it without referendum. And I'll tell you where this came from. This came from Mayor Dermer was very concerned at one time, and there was city litigation on this. There was a private property owner who next to his home had a beachfront access street end. And essentially, and then you had a park.
Okay,
What this private property owner had apparently done for years and years and years was landscaped and gated the right of way so that it was essentially private. It was privatization of public land. And we went to litigation over the city's right to remove the encroachments. And at the end, the city prevailed. But in order to ensure that that never happened again, Mayor Dermer crafted this provision, which attempted to keep right-of-way easements that were deeded to the public for beach access public, unless the voter decided otherwise.
But Ms. Latone, I'd just like to add to your question about the alleys in particular, and Alton Court is a great example. Is Commissioner, the amendment sponsored by Commissioner Rosen Gonzalez last year would now require a referendum to vacate, for instance, the Alton Court alley for the Michael Schvo project. A referendum would now be required to vacate the 6th Street right of way for the 5th and Alton and Canopy Park project. A referendum would also be required today for the vacation of 21st Street for the Bulgari. So that amendment, which is in the middle of 1.03C, does now require voter approval
okay.
for the vacation of those alleys or other rights of way.
So it is a little convoluted.
Well, it goes to the point I was trying to make. It goes to the point I was trying to make, which is, it feels like we are chasing our tails. Somebody comes up with a creative thing.
Exactly.
We don't like it.
I guess
They get theirs,
I
but
guess I
then
am
the next guy
creative.
doesn't.
I guess I was the creative person, but
Yeah.
that was not the intent.
No, I get you. I get you,
know-
but
And I know the thing was, until you get to the actual vacation request and you do a title search,
Mhm.
then, you have no way of knowing that, to the naked eye, this would be waterfront. And maybe, we didn't know at the time
of course not.
that there were
course not.
intervening parcels, because we certainly probably would have carved something in there.
Yeah, no, and I was talking more about these alley vacations
Oh,
because
okay.
it seems like
Right.
so now there's a big to do. We need a referendum. The referendum usually passes 80% of the voters or more in most cases. And then, okay, it's closed, but perhaps the damage has already been done.
But
Yeah.
exactly.
And so the approach might be to let's take a look at how you maybe are all encompassing and only create the exceptions.
Right. And just to
Exactly what
follow
I
that, subsection D talks about public beach right of way easements or street ends. E talks about, the other street ends that are at value, which are those bordering GU property, the golf course. And that actually was prompted by litigation with the Lagorce golf
Yeah.
course with regard to,
I remember when I arrived, there was a rash of just street
Yes.
ends between single family homes.
Yes.
That were being vacated
right.
and closing
and
out
then
view
that's-
corridors and
Right, the last one
access
you're
points.
talking about is street ends that end on the water, where we had, and these were public street ends for we had a number of these on the Venetian Islands.
North Bay Road.
And North Bay Road, where the property owners obviously would come and say, hey, let's can you vacate this to me? I'll pay for it. And, and it becomes part of my property only. And I think in that case was only to not have the nuisance of, somebody walking or driving onto your street end. And, it's not often I blow our horn, the cities, but to our credit, we've managed to keep these street ends on North Bay Road
Right.
and the Venetian Islands open, and open to the public. So this provision has worked better than the waterfront provision.
These are, I mean, the streets, these are those little roads that extend for like 100 feet that.
Right.
Like if you're up along North Bay Road.
Yeah.
To the water, there's a value to that view corridor and to that public access, whether it's just a passive bench or a kayak launch or whatever.
Right.
Many of those homeowners were saying, come in, let's just, either side gets the benefit of saying, let's get rid of these things.
Right. And the flip of the coin is, and with regard to North Bay Road, we did have testimony from the occasional citizen that says, I take my kid there on Sunday and we
Mhm.
fish off the end, and stuff like that. And,
Yeah, I mean, I do kind of wonder what those are there for, like, they're not developed. I mean, shouldn't we
No.
do some, my feeling is either kind of fish or cut bait, either actually develop those, put little parks and benches there, or
Mhm.
just give them to the homeowners.
yeah,
Give-
flip
give-
side of the coin
give the
was, and
city
we did
20 million
receive
bucks.
complaints that the city was not properly maintaining
Yeah.
these street ends
And-
and that they were blighted.
I mean, think how much the city could make. I mean, an acre on North Bay on the water side is probably worth 30-40 million dollars. I mean, if the city could
Yeah.
get that, that could solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, we could have turned them into little pocket parks or not, but
Yeah.
I was
But-
only city manager for
but-
4
but
months.
don't we-
and that-
I know, but
that was
don't-
not part of my
But
job.
isn't the status quo the worst of all options, if we're being honest here? No one's really using the land, but we're not getting the $40 million. I mean, think about that for a second. We sit here and the city's been futzing for years and years about how to fund that 18-acre former par 3 golf course. We had to get state money to do it, $3 million. That's near my house, so I want to see them develop it. And I think the groundbreaking's in a few weeks, if I'm not mistaken. But we futzed for years and years and years to get the funding for that, and it's still not complete. I think it's 80% funded with a bond and everything. We could pay for the whole damn thing if we just sold one of those street ends on North Bay Road for $40 million.
Well, I don't think the street ends are wide enough where you'd be able to develop them.
Well, sure, but you could sell it to the homeowners and
Sell it
say,
to the
hey,
homeowner.
you can now add, 8,000, 10,000 square feet to your lot, which is going to improve your home value, and they'll pay it.
Correct.
Right.
Well, were they going to pay?
In most of those cases, they were going for free.
Yeah, but here's the thing. You can say, hey, guys, we
Yeah, the
appreciate
Venetian,
your
they-
interest.
yeah, they
We'll
were
sell it.
just- They were just taken over. The one in 8701, we did get $10 million for it, which was put into the park.
Well, how many of these street ends are there?
Oh, there's waterfront easements all over the city. There's on the Venetian Islands, there's several.
So why aren't we tapping into that?
That's a different question.
I don't know. That's a good question.
Who would be in charge of that very obvious decision?
Well, I think each one is a policy question for the commission to consider. I mean, there are street ends on the east side of the island at the beach that are, there are street ends along the golf
Those are-
courses.
yeah,
There
right.
are street ends along the
Sometimes
bay.
access roads
but-
to public access.
Yeah, the
roads to
ones we're
beach,
thinking
right?
about are North Bay Road,
Lagorce,
the
Pine Tree.
Venetian Islands, Lagorce, there are still some. But the ones that end at the water are just pretty much, I think the only thing that we're budgeted to do is to mow the lawn occasionally and, keep them, but they're not, I mean, there was a suggestion they could be little pocket parks, but
I mean, that's the obvious thing is say, okay, if there's a dozen of them on North Bay Road, we're gonna put them up to offer to the people who are adjacent and
sometimes there's opposition from the residents, from the adjacent property owners that really don't want people attracted to those
Right,
street ends.
then tell them to buy it. Tell them you have
Right.
2 options. You can pay a reasonable and frankly discounted, set the price at about 70% of market value
Right.
for whatever that is, the half-acre space. They're saying this is a
Right.
good opportunity to buy it, add it to your lot. You'd be dumb not to, because it's gonna be immediately balance sheet accretive to you. And then take the money we make from that, and the ones that don't get bought, we turn into little parks with benches and cute little kayak spots and whatever things the people want. And keep the difference, which would be a 9-figure amount of money for the city and can fund all the damn stuff that we sit and
Right.
bicker about on the commission.
Yeah, but what you need to do is find a commissioner to sponsor that legislation. I mean, that's going to originate from the commission.
That's not
Sure.
a charter.
You
Is there
got-
any way we can push it along? Is there any way we can sort of clear the way for it so that and raise public conversation by putting it in the charter?
I don't think
don't
you
know.
would get the votes.
I
To
don't
be
think
honest
it's a
with you.
charter issue. I think it's,
Yeah.
it's
The
a
charter
public
issue is how
policy
you dispose
issue.
of it, but do you want to is the question, and
know-
that's a policy question.
You're doing exactly what this board was meant to do at this point, which is fact finding.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you start to make your final recommendations, you may want to have ancillary recommendations that you make.
That maybe aren't charter, but are things to
Sure.
consider.
Well, I understand where our mandate ends and the politicians begin, and I'm glad we have that separation. But it feels like right now, if a commissioner had this idea and brought it up, one of the first reactions would be there's really nothing in the charter that dictates how this is handled. Would that be correct?
Yes.
No, there is.
Well, I think we would have to
Absolutely
look at each one individually and
It
whether.
may not be perfect, but it's here. You got to go
There's
through
a-
all of
it's like a- it's
this,
right.
and then
It's the
if
same as the
it
sale
meets
of-
criteria for number 4, then it's whatever number 4 says.
I can tell you, Brian, that just, and only from my experience, but the reason we haven't done more with them, number one is budget. And number two has been resident opposition.
Yeah, but if you
It's
listen, to
really not a charter issue, though, I don't think.
unless you
You know,
were
it's
I
kind of like a
had this
NIMBY
conversation.
argument.
Sure, I know, and I know I'm maybe trying to force the conversation and clear the battle. What if you could argue it is a charter issue only in the sense that this really is a sort of, I don't say monopsonistic, to use an old econ term, but there's only one buyer for this land, which is
For
the
sure,
adjacent.
it's the adjacent property. Yeah.
And so now it's not really an open bid, which would be, so it does need its own handling, because this is not an open bid. We don't want some random guy buying, 10,000 square feet on North Bay Road. Someone probably would buy it, but you'd be jamming in a neighbor there, which would be obstructive. This really feels like a very unique
Well,
situation.
remember,
Yeah.
also, when you vacate these,
Mhm.
the only persons you
can only
can't s-
vacate
you
to the
can't sell
adjacent
it.
owner.
The only persons that are eligible for the are the adjacent property owners.
And there's a
50-50.
procedure for
Yeah,
that.
yeah, but to your
So
point.
we can't sell it.
I think Brian, I think the
We
bigger
can't
question,
vacate it and sell it.
as the manager, what I would look at is, say, all right, is there any other public use for that space that I would now or in the future conceive of? Outfalls, pump stations,
Right. No, we in fact
stormwater
do have a-
improvement, seawalls,
Pump
things.
station on North Bay
Right.
Road.
Well, you
Now we're
might,
talking about NIMBY.
well, but the engineering might require it. It's NIMBY or
Right,
flooded
in the-
roads.
In the Venetian Isles, we have a pump
You have
station.
a pump
on one
station
of
on
them,
one of them.
because nobody wanted it
Yeah.
in front of their house, so we
house.
put it on the street end.
Sure. Look, my guess, I mean, if we're looking at how government works here, we all know how this plays out. The voters would reject it. Say, oh, no, you can't give away our city. But then if you just say, hey, well, wait a minute. It's not a lot of skin up, it's not a big issue to give up some of these street ends, which let's face it, I used to look at them, you're like, what the hell are these here for? Like, what, occasionally someone walks by and looks at the water. If we could generate $100 million for the city, that could solve all our problems. So it's probably a good thing to do, but to your point, it's not really, the politicians don't want to touch it because they oh, you're giving away our land. And then we don't really think it's our mandate, even though we probably could push it a little bit. Per your point, you said there was just all this ambiguity, and so you stepped
Right.
in. Well, then it does feel like something that's sort of a chartered.
Right. And that brings me to a good point with regard to D and E. The question I want to pose to you is it really necessary anymore to distinguish between whether it's on a street end, whether it's on a golf course or a waterfront, or do you want to treat vacation of city right of ways or street ends? Do you want to treat them all with an
again-
equal standard?
No, we
That's something I want to pose to you, because
I'm so
we need to
passionate about
distinguish
this.
these categories.
But this is, I mean, of course, it should even be a question that these street ends that I'm going to go ahead and say are pretty useless and on extremely valuable land should be totally distinguished from something that touches the ocean, which really does feel like public land and important to the public. But I'm a little surprised that the city has a multi-$100 million opportunity here that we're just kind of
Right.
kissing away over
Yeah.
bureaucracy.
One thing I want to say is, again, historically, there's always been a higher scrutiny and more of a discussion when you're talking about the sale or other conveyance of city property. In other words, when you're just getting rid of it permanently.
Mhm.
That's always really, that's where you get to talking about higher votes,
Mhm.
higher, referendum.
Mhm.
Lease, not so much, because eventually
They'll
you're
come
going to
back,
get that
yeah.
property back, and
Mhm.
chances are you'll get it back improved. But when you're talking about conveyance, and a vacation is essentially a conveyance, because once you vacate it, it's private property. Do you want to, are they all equally important? you know, because you're vacating
That's your
public
point.
property.
That's your point. They're not.
That's your point.
Yeah, and in this particular case, this land is uniquely useful as private property. And it's just unrealized value for the owner of the home and even more unrealized value for the city itself. You could have the city realize 80% of the upside and the homeowners be very happy to get 20% upside on a $20 million parcel of land. So it's just,
That's called inflation. It was 10 million just a few minutes ago.
Yeah. now it's, there we go. Well, I'm saying, now I'm talking about, you were talking 10 million for half the parcel,
Okay.
20 for the entirety, if both neighbors take it, which I think they will.
Yeah.
But I just have to laugh because, this is such a great opportunity and it feels like it'll never get done for all the little tripwires that stop good things from getting done when good people just futz all day.
And I think, Brian, the way these usually come up is their individual requests from, from a property owner, from an adjacent property owner or a developer. That's how these transactions usually arise.
You're always going to look at the public benefit. I mean, $10 million and in the 500 Alton vacation of 6th Street, that portion of 6th Street, the park, which, the 1.5 acre park
Mhm.
that we received.
3 acre.
Public park.
Mhm.
So, you're always going to have to look at the vacation. So what I want to leave you is, because we're finally done with all the
Good, good, good. Sorry.
conveyances and the under.
Fireworks, we
under
saved the grand
section
finale for the
1.03. Right. I mean, I've seen your questions, but what I want to leave you with again with vacations, shall we treat them all the same? And just not because are they all equally important? Maybe the answer is yes. So with that, I think, does anybody have any questions with regard to my portion? Because it's okay, because if not, I just want to turn it over to Nick. Okay.
Yeah,
And
just-
you can certainly email me. Mr. Clerk, if you can provide them with my email.
Yeah, I think we're heading here because I assume it's on the agenda later and one of the items here for Fernandez, but we are going to discuss, right, that the new state law.
Yeah,
That's coming up
That's
right
coming
now.
next.
good.
That's coming next. So Raul, I think speaking on behalf of the committee, let me, if I'm misstating it, then please jump in, but this is a section of the charter code that we do want to come and revisit. How and what it ultimately looks like is to be determined, but let's put that on the revisit list. I would ask you all to kind of start looking at it from a perspective of what we've described as simplifying,
Yes,
and then bring us those options of, higher or lower scrutiny, vacation, non-vacation, management, concession, et cetera. Where are those trigger points where we want to draw nuances so that we
Yes.
can put that out there and see? My interest would be to capture as much of city property as we can.
I think
with
that's
this.
an excellent idea because again, right now, there's a lot of these provisions that you can't read without a legal interpretation.
Correct. Or a survey.
And and if you're an administrator or a public citizen, it can be off-putting.
Does it, I don't want to create too much extra work here, but does it make sense to take this and put it into a table of some sort?
Mhm.
So that we can,
That's
like
interesting.
the zoning, so that we can, instead of trying to deal with stuff.
I think ultimately we'll get there.
Well, I'm thinking now, if you were to try to tabulate, put this in some sort of a big table, then we could say, oh, this and this we should combine. You could see it more easily.
You mean, would you like me to prepare a table?
Yeah, to
Is that
kind
a
of help us
reasonable
consider it.
request?
Yeah.
You think it makes sense to
Sure.
do? Yeah.
Together with the universe of all of the
Right.
agreements that
So-
are out there.
Instead of
a cheat
us
sheet.
trying
Yeah,
to
sure.
do this. we'll,
Agreed.
you know,
That's fair. And whether that's how it ends up in the charter or not, at least it lets the dialogue flow.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier for us to see.
No problem.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you very much for indulging me.
Well,
And,
thank you.
With that, I'm going to turn it over to Deputy City Attorney Kalergis. There's a new state law, as you know, it hasn't been signed by the governor yet. So as far as I'm aware, it's not technically into law. Mr. Kalergis will also be issuing a city attorney opinion to the commission with regard to the impacts of the law, particularly on our charter provision 103C, which talks about the increase of FAR being subject to referendum.
Okay, before we go there, Ralph, do you need anything else to put a closure on item 2?
I do not know.
You got? Okay.
The question is, do you want us to proceed? Because it's now 7:10 and this board has a strict rule of finishing. So I just want to know. Give that. option to
Well,
the
I'll
board.
ask Nick. How long or how short is your item?
I can shorten the presentation. It is a meaty issue. Of
course.
You know, this 1.03C, unlike the provisions that Raul has walked us through, relates to private development. The 1.03C would be significantly impacted by a bill passed by the legislature this session, which as Raul pointed out, has
Let's-
not been signed into
Let's
law
let's
yet.
proceed and let's just get to where we
Okay.
can by 7:30 and then we'll pick up
Okay.
where we left off.
Sure. So just to start off and just to frame the discussion, what 1.03C governs is any increase in the zoned floor area ratio of a property or street end in the city. And floor area ratio, FAR, is the term that is the measure that we use as a city to regulate the overall size of a building. FAR is expressed as a number. There's a maximum FAR for each zoning district in the city. And when you multiply that number by the square footage of your property, that will tell you basically how many buildable square feet you have, subject to whatever the maximum height is in that district, subject to whatever your minimum setbacks are and any other design regulations in the code. But the FAR is going to give you basically the overall size of the building. And without going through the history of 1.03C, the basic requirement is that any increase to the zoned floor area ratio of a property as it existed on November 7th, 2001, any increase to the zoned FAR of a property requires the approval of the voters in a citywide referendum. So the 1.03C was created in a series of referenda. It started with a requirement for FAR increases on waterfront property, and over time it was expanded to include an FAR increase on any property within the city. For a very long time, no FAR increase was submitted to the voters after the charter was amended. The first amendment was in 2015, which was for it was a proposed amendment for certain properties in North Beach for Ocean Terrace, and that first one actually failed. It was in November of 2015. So since the adoption of this charter amendment, the city has submitted a total of 12 FAR increases to the voters. We've researched them and 4 were rejected, but the other 8 were approved. We've construed 1.03C very broadly over the years to apply not just to a straight FAR increase from one number to another, but also to any text amendment to the land development regulations that would result in an FAR increase. For instance, we've adopted an ordinance that created certain exceptions from what counts as FAR, FPL vault rooms, required bicycle parking, stairwells and elevators to the roof deck. That ordinance came out of a recommendations of the land use committee. That ordinance was determined that it would result in a net increase in available floor area. So that required voter approval. The voters did approve it. Another example would be an ordinance permitting the reintroduction of floor plates in historic buildings. So these are so buildings that, for instance, were converted in the 90s to become either a theater or a nightclub. In order to reconstruct original floor plates in those historic buildings, because those buildings are now non-conforming as to FAR, that was determined to result in a net increase in floor area ratios. That was submitted to the voters. That one actually failed the first time and passed the second time. So the provisions of 1.03C as to FAR are fairly broad. Do you have any questions about just what it applies to before I get into the current state law and the bill that was passed by the legislature?
We're good. Thank you.
Okay. So the tricky part about 1.03C is that the city attorneys over the years have been asked to look at this issue because there are provisions in state law that restrict what's called zoning by referendum, meaning submitting individual zoning requests to the will of the voters. And that statute is part of the Community Planning Act, which used to be known as the Growth Management Act. Basically the original restrictions in that state law were that a local government could not require voter approval for an individual development order. Meaning, if you apply for, let's say you apply for a building permit for a single family home, or for a multifamily apartment building, or you apply for the HPB or DRB for the design of a new project, cities have been prohibited for a very long time from requiring voter approval on any of those kinds of development orders. So this is something we've struggled with over the years because the city charter is not absolute and has to be construed and applied in a manner that is consistent with state law. So what's changed this year, and the governor has not yet signed the bill into law, but the legislature adopted a bill that would prohibit an initiative or referendum process in regard to any land development regulation. So land development regulation is the technical term for what we know informally as our zoning code or our zoning ordinance. If the governor signs the bill and it's Senate Bill 718 into law, then that's going to significantly limit to what extent we can enforce the referendum requirement in 1.03C. Senate Bill 718 does leave intact a an existing carve out for local government charters that require voter approval prior to a map amendment or a comprehensive plan amendment. A map amendment, and I know these concepts are technical, so feel free to interject, but with a question. But a map amendment is when you rezone a property from one zoning district classification to another. So for instance, a map amendment from RM1, which is a residential multifamily low intensity district, to RM2, which is a residential multifamily medium intensity district, that would result in an increase to the district's zone FAR, because the FAR for the less intense district is 1.25 and the FAR for RM2 is 2.0, by way of example, right? So we believe that if the governor signs 718 into law, that our charter will still require voter approval prior to a rezoning. So for instance, for that, for that scenario, voter approval would still be required. Where we would not be able to require voter approval is the kinds of examples I've given you, which is the text amendments for the reintroduction of floor plates in historic buildings.
For just 63rd Street, the development on 63rd Street, that'd be an example, the one that Stephen Ross was going to do. That was the last vote we had like this, correct?
Correct, and right for the
Deauville, yeah, the Deauville.
for the Deauville site. And that was the other example I was going to give, which is that the developer of and he's a contract, may still be actually contract purchaser of the 6701 Collins Avenue Collins Avenue property where the Deauville was. That proposal was basically an overlay district that would create and that would increase the current maximum FAR for properties meeting certain requirements. That is not a map amendment. So if Senate Bill 718 is signed into law, a proposal like that one, the creation of an overlay, we would not be able to enforce the referendum requirement in our charter.
Real quick on that, just because I think that's probably the best example we can use because it's recent and pretty hot. But did the commission vote on that before it went to voters?
Yes.
I remember they voted and then it went to voters after, correct?
Yes.
And what was the final tally on that vote?
I'd have to check the tally off the top of my head. I remember that there were I think there were 4 votes to submit the measure to the voters.
Yeah, but it wasn't a vote on the project, I don't think. It was just a vote to put it to referendum, right?
Well, right, there
There was
could be
still
no,
development agreement and a lot of other things that needed to come of it.
correct, yeah,
And it didn't mean that they necessarily approved of the project. There's a lot of cases where they might, if it was
Yeah, let
their
the voters
vote, they
decide.
might have voted no,
Right.
but they're very unlikely to vote. No, we won't let the voters.
Yeah,
vote
that's
on
a
something.
that's a simple political decision.
And the reason it's 4 votes at that stage is because to submit any measure to the voters, the city commission is required to adopt a resolution, and a resolution only requires 4 votes.
And the same example here, the reason that the approach was through an overlay and not amending the FAR and not have an overlay was what?
So, these changes are proposed in any number of ways. The best answer I could give you now is that an overlay is an opportunity to draft a more narrowly tailored regulation that is going to have less impacts on the overall zoning district. I've been here I've worked here for almost 10 years, and the tendency is when the city commission is looking at the land development regulations to try to adopt changes that are narrowly tailored, particularly when the change is going to result in either an increase in development rights, an increase in intensity, additional uses that are maybe not currently permitted. If it were proposed as a rezoning from one district classification to another,
Right.
that comes with a lot of other things: increased density, dwelling units per acre, increased, the intensity of the uses that are permitted in that district is greater. So there are other sort of collateral issues that come with a rezoning.
An
Although
overlay
I'm
tells
sorry.
you what you want your city to be.
Yeah.
It tells you how you want
Mhm.
it to look like, and you can say, you know what, this is not good for this area. If we want to try to say the Faena district,
Right.
kind of thing.
But it may open a door to kind of abuse now if this is in lieu of a map change, which would require a referendum. We're going to go this route. Which apparently doesn't require a referendum or won't once the governor signs this bill. That I think seems to be the crux of what we might want to deal with is what are the things we still would like a referendum with?
Mhm.
And what are the things where we're kind of either can't or don't want to deal with it anymore?
But the challenge will be that this state, I will tell you that the sheer simplicity of this bill is, and we look at the preemptions that the legislature proposes every year very closely. This one is very simple.
Yeah.
And it's that it basically is that an initiative or referendum process on a land development regulation is prohibited.
But this is going to happen. So look, the way it looks like this is starting to play out is, a bunch of developers convinced the governor, hey, these stupid, annoying little referendums
Right.
are stopping us from being able to build these grand visionary projects that would really uplift Florida at a local level. And so the best thing to do is just cut out this red tape and get rid of the sending this to the voters.
Yeah, preempt.
Preempt it. But then now we're going to have a backlash that's going to create more problems because what Mr. Fernandez is proposing is to set such a high vote threshold that barely anything is going to get through, which is going to backfire against the developers now, who might actually find it's harder to get things done requiring 6/7 vote than it was when you
versus a
sent it to the
referendum.
voters.
And it would inhibit regular people that are workforce housing or middle income housing from being able to have their homes too, because if we ever get away from that serious, high end development of hotels, that's something to consider too, because it's not just, we're focused on, say, the Deauville, but there's other things that come into play.
Yeah, with all due respect to Mr. Fernandez, this feels like a thing San Francisco would do. Just like this sort of tit for tat, let's make it harder and harder and harder to develop anything. And I mean, 6/7 is a really high bar. I think it's almost a chutzpah ask. I'm using a Yiddish term there. I mean, how's anything going to get through 6/7? I mean, that's a pretty
Yeah.
high.
Well,
listen,
it happens all the time
Yeah.
with when the city wants to sell property or something and it has a 6/7 vote required. It happens all the
Right,
time.
it exists today and
But a question on this, just technical question, Nick. So if somebody has a particular building that they're putting up and, can they does it have to be part of a zoning change? Or, I mean, can they go to the commission and say, I would like, and to increase the FAR to be increased on this block by this amount, for my property? Is that something that can be done, or does it have to be done as part of an overlay? Or, I mean, or can it now just be done for a specific project?
Well, I think that can be done in any number of, I mean, this doesn't change how an FAR increase is proposed, right? I mean, I think it depends on.
But you wouldn't do that just in one property. You can't, that's like spot zoning. You would do like RM1, and from now on, RM1 is now 1.5 instead of 1.25.
Spot zoning is a nuance, is a nuanced legal analysis, just like any other, right? You have to look at the specific facts, and we adopt regulations, here all the time that apply to a limited number of properties, and that doesn't mean we're spot zoning. Spot zoning is very specifically a rezoning of an individual site in a manner that is totally inconsistent with the surrounding properties, and that creates a severe imbalance. That spot zoning is not just a regulation that applies to a limited number of properties.
Yeah. But again, sticking with examples, because I just think it's the easiest way to do this. The Deauville property, that is exactly sort of what's in play in this consideration, right? That is something that once the governor signs this bill could not happen again in the future, where the people of the city vote on whether to give Stephen Ross another 1.5.
Not the way it was, right? Not the way it was proposed. No, we could not call a referendum on that measure.
Correct. And I'm not saying, what's the movie, Follow the Money? All the presidents may, it feels like we're following the money here. This was probably pushed by, if not Mr. Ross specifically, people with similar financial interest in him who were probably saying, hey.
All across the state, probably.
Yeah.
Well,
All across the state.
I think for us as a committee, I mean, this is a situation where it sounds like the voters had a right
Mhm.
that is now being preempted,
Correct.
right?
Or
That-
just taken
that-
away.
so-
Just taken away.
Taken away.
Yeah.
So I think what Commissioner Fernandez is saying is, okay, in lieu of that right
Yeah.
that we used to have that now you don't have, what should we do to approach or approximate it? 6/7 is a pretty high bar, yes. Some would say that's not enough. Well, for the last 10 years, it hasn't been. It had to go to referendum. And so for us, what I think he's asking us is to opine on this item, but I'm not sure that, the elected officials will do what they're going to do with this item. We still have a situation with what, if anything, do we want to do in the charter?
Yeah, so that's fair, but I'm gonna step here and push back on one thing, which is,
Okay.
it sounds like, sorry, we have 30 seconds here.
Okay.
Well, push back. It sounds like the commission previously basically punted on their right to settle this and gave it to voters, which is fine. They kind of said, we don't want to handle this ourselves. Let's give this to the voters. That's fine. Now, through no choice of their own, it has to be settled by somebody. But it feels like the problem with this is that it's not empowering the commission, it's empowering individual commissioners, because basically everyone has a near veto right on anything
Correct.
getting developed. And that's a pretty dangerous situation.
Yeah, but Brian,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
yeah.
I just want to.
Go ahead,
Because
address
she's got that question, but I want to respond to that because the way this came about originally
Yeah.
was a citizen-led petition-driven initiative.
Yeah.
The citizen said, we don't want the commission making this decision anymore.
Yeah.
We're taking it.
That's right.
Fast forward 20-something years and here's where we find ourselves.
Again, we can't turn into San Francisco. As a San Francisco refugee, I got to tell everyone here, we cannot let Miami Beach turn into San Francisco, where the citizens rise up every time you try to put down a park bench.
Julie.
I think it's a minimal recommendation in terms of a guardrail, frankly, but I wouldn't leave it just to the commission. For example, we already have provisions that require the planning board to vote for
Things,
7,
yeah.
for example, plus a 6-7 vote by commission. So I think it's a start. I mean,
All
I
right.
certainly think, I mean, we don't obviously need to debate it entirely at
All
the
right.
Oh,
moment.
question,
but-
and I mean, he's got this teed up, but what happens now? Let's say the law, the governor signs it.
Mhm.
Then what is the process
Well, that,
for FAR increases.
that's something that the city commission is looking at, right? Commissioner Fernandez referred this particular question to you about whether to adopt a 6/7 requirement. By the way, whether to adopt that would be in the land development regulations.
Correct.
If this passes, we could not call a referendum to put a 6/7 requirement in the charter. So the commission could by ordinance decide, okay, we are going to require 6/7 to increase FAR, but it can't go into the charter.
But can the commission, let's say the commission does that, but then the next deal comes along and somebody doesn't, or a year from now, the commission doesn't like it, they could change it down. They could make it, switch it from 6/7 to 5/7.
Well, and let me also finish, 'cause I want to answer your question, which was, what is going to be the process?
Right.
Commissioner Fernandez has referred this question to you. Commissioner Minor has referred a similar question to the Land Use Committee and the Planning Board. And then we're also working with Commissioner Fernandez on what, and I don't think this has been placed on an agenda yet, but on what the requirements will be. For instance, additional public outreach, specific, factual analyses of what an increase, would cause.
That still doesn't answer the question. Let's say that the DeSantis signs this next week and this becomes effective in 30 days or whatever the minimum is. What is the process if we're still talking about it, if the commissioner
we need to
hasn't
go
done
to
it?
planning
Like,
board.
it would be the process for any other land development regulation. So it could either initiate with a private application directly to the planning board. Then the planning board is required to make a recommendation. The planning board is our local planning agency required under state law. They make a recommendation, transmit it to the city commission, and then 2 readings and 1 or 2 public hearings
But
would be
there's
required.
no
by the-
obligation that it has to be approved.
And what
No,
is
there is
it a
not.
5-2 vote for LD?
Under our code, it's a 5/7.
I mean, 5/7. Okay, so
5/7.
right now, so the only real question here is should we go from 5/7 to 6/7?
Well, that's the question that Commissioner Fernandez has posed to you, but
It's
you may have
5/7,
other.
so the planning is required right now?
No, the planning board is required to make a recommendation,
Okay.
but the planning board could transmit an unfavorable recommendation
Sure.
and it could still proceed as long as the
Okay.
city commission approves it on a 5/7 vote.
Okay.
All right, guys, I got a question over here.
I just have one question. I know this is strange, but I just read this morning. There was a developer in, I believe, New York. It may have been California that purchased about 350,000 square feet of cubic yards of air rights because they couldn't build what they wanted in height in their city. So by purchasing air rights, that gave them the ability to build up. Do we have anything like that?
We do not. Now, we've had conversations about transfers of development rights with TDRs. The city of Miami has done that successfully for instance, for the MIMO corridor, where historic properties on Biscayne Boulevard have been permitted to sell their development rights to properties, say downtown, where the additional density is more compatible, and that in turn finances the restoration of these important historic buildings. But we do not have any process like that in our code. If we were to adopt one today, let's say the governor does not sign 718 into law, that would result in an FAR increase. It would
It
need to be
triggers-
submitted to the
it triggers,
voters.
yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry for the strange question.
No, that's a very good
okay.
question.
We're
Yeah.
kind of running on the end, so obviously we're not finished with this. What does Commissioner Fernandez want? Is this, he wants us to consider it as we deliberate? Or is this coming before the city commission that he wanted to hear from us in some way?
I think.
This referral, what does he want us?
I mean, the truth is that the governor has not yet signed the bill into law, so I leave to the board whether if you want to continue discussing this, if you're ready to make a recommendation, I suppose you
Oh,
could transmit
yeah.
one if contingent on if the governor does sign it into law. But there are, as I mentioned, there's a separate discussion that will be scheduled at some point before the Land Use Committee and the Planning Board that Commissioner Minor has sponsored. So I leave to you, obviously.
Yeah, it seems to be that he's looking at, should we go to 6/7 instead of 5/7? All right, let's, we're.
One other
switching
quick
out.
question, I don't think we're ready to, because one
Right.
thought that comes to mind here is impact and size of the project and whether it would be permissible for us, as part of those regulations to say, okay, if it's above X thousand square feet, it goes to 6/7 vote, but if it's, you know, if it's a small one, it could go to 5/7 vote, just for example. Is there the leeway to do that kind of thing?
on that?
I think so.
Yeah, we have something like that for developments for the planning board, where
Yeah.
if it's greater than 50,000 square feet.
Right, conditional use,
Triggers.
yeah, conditional use approval is required, right? Yes.
Okay, guys, on this item, I think we're incomplete, so let's
Sorry.
bring it to the next one.
I'm sorry,
Um,
you want to bring this item again for the next meeting?
Next
Okay,
meeting,
got
yeah.
it.
Or I guess maybe not the next one, because I have a question. We have, there's an item on here as well. So that's item 3. So we've done 2, 3. Item 4 is just notifying us that the council did in fact, or commission did in fact extend us. So that's good news for
Yay.
everybody.
Good job.
Michael, you get your parking pass. Yes, revived new life. Okay, and then number 5 is a simple question, guys. Apparently there's a scheduling conflict with some of our staff members that support this committee.
With all of us.
With
Oh,
the
with
two,
both
with
of-
the
both
two
of
of
you?
us, yeah.
The two of you? Both of you are missing. So June 27th, our next scheduled meeting. And so the question was, should we cancel that meeting or proceed? We're struggling with dates, and I know that we're tight, and so there will be other support staff here. It's not like we're gonna be left alone to our own devices, right?
Yeah.
The cat's away.
So what we would do is
We can do all kinds of things, right, Brian?
Party. I'll be
sell every street end.
sodas, beers.
We would invite if, because we would like to touch on other topics. We were thinking of discussing the Citizens Bill of Rights and have Gene Nolan come in, which is something that's a little simpler, and have someone else take notes as far as,
Okay.
so we could do that if you wish. We wouldn't do any, we wouldn't continue item
Okay,
3.
yeah, we won't continue this for the 27th. We can bring that
Yeah.
at the August meeting that we have.
Okay.
So we can talk about,
Is
and
that- But
we'll-
I leave it up to the committee's desires. Yeah,
27th, except for me. Okay.
Well, I think, you know, we've got a lot of things that we want to do and.
Yeah.
You know, I think we should, whatever tasks we could. That
Where's your
don't rely, who's not around? Nick and,
neither of us are, we're doing canvassing board that day.
oh, okay, and what about Raul? Is he around? Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so
we would
Raul
have
is-
some legal,
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
would.
Gene
yeah,
is gonna come as
and
well.
We would have Gene Nolan, who,
Okay.
and the topic that.
oh
we-
yeah, Gene, right,
That we've
okay.
asked is the Citizens Bill of Rights.
I think we should keep the meeting.
Okay.
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 All right, so let's do that, guys. Let's plan on keeping the meeting. Don't bring this follow-up to that meeting.
Correct. We'll do it at the
Do
August
that at
1st meeting.
the next meeting. And then, Marcia, can we get something back from you on whether it's Alina or whomever she wants to designate to come and close out the charter officer comments? Hopefully for some time in August, so we can
Yeah.
put that to bed as well.
Oh, it's, yeah, it's nice up there.
I can't hear.
Yeah, it's where it's where all the, yeah, it's that's where the party's.
I think what she confirmed with Charles in Rafael's office was the August date, but I was checking the calendar and you called me, so I'm not positive, but that's what I think it was.
Okay.
We don't have any
We
confirmation.
don't? I thought it was August, but I'll confirm.
Okay.
Okay, so our next meeting is June 27th, and then we have August 1st, I think.
Correct, yes.
August 1st.
How will I get notes from the June 27th? Can someone?
Well, we'll do the minutes,
Minutes.
or you can watch.
Oh, yeah, I can make sure that, yeah,
Can you email?
sure.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what is it you want us to email you?
Email the minutes,
As soon as we, yeah, when we have them, we will email them to you.
and can you watch? Is this live or?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll be out 6 hours ahead.
We will email the minutes like we normally do. I can't promise that we'll do them any quicker, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't video archived, is it? Is it only live or is it video archived?
We
It's
want to go
it's
watch
Zoom.
it again.
These are recorded, aren't they?
It's
Yeah, these
Zoom.
are,
Watch it.
no, but.
Yeah, so you can
saying
watch it,
it's
you
archived.
can watch it the next day, yeah.
Send her the
It's
link.
Recorded.
Yes, it's in
It's
Zoom.
recorded.
And
So why don't you
and you
send-
can watch
can
it
you-
anytime you want
Yeah.
in Zoom. Yes, it
Can you-
is. We record the Zoom meetings.
Okay.
Can you email the link
Thank you,
to
PJ.
Elizabeth
Which link?
to the meeting, the June 27th meeting?
It's the
Once
same
done-
link every meeting.
No, but so she can watch it at a later time.
Video archive.
We can send you the Zoom link.
Zoom link, so she can
Yeah.
watch it later before the August meeting.
Yeah,
so
sure.
you're caught up on the plane or something like that, right?
Right, PJ? It's just because Nick is looking at me funny.
Because you,
The
the
Zoom link-
Zoom link is if she's watching it live, but it's.
No, the Zoom link is recorded, right, PJ? And we can send you, and PJ can send the link to Miss Latone with a password that she can view it whenever she wants, right? On YouTube too? Look at that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can do that.
YouTube. Now we're YouTube celebrities, I guess. Okay, so. I'm sorry. So item 2 drops into this issues for future discussion.
Yes.
And I think we're done with business for today then, right, guys?
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you so much.
Hundreds of millions of dollars.